Panic time? Is it panic time? I don't know.
Panic seems to be setting in, and honestly, it's not difficult to understand why. Something significant has happened around the WNBA, and this time, it goes beyond the usual rumors and social media speculation. This isn't simply another controversial take from an anonymous account or a blogger looking for attention. Reports now suggest that Caitlin Clark, the superstar who has become one of the most recognizable faces in women's basketball and helped attract an entirely new audience to the sport, is involved in a contract situation that could have major consequences for the direction of the league. If those reports prove accurate, the WNBA could be facing a development that changes the conversation about its future in a very big way.
This changes everything. This changes.
What happens when the biggest star in a league suddenly has an option outside that league that changes the entire balance of power? That is the question surrounding Caitlin Clark right now. According to the claims presented in the original report, a deal worth $225 million and fully guaranteed would put Clark in a completely different financial position, while also separating her from the pressures, decisions, and restrictions that have surrounded her time in the WNBA. The story also points toward two major figures, Amber Cox and Cathy Engelbert, arguing that their previous decisions helped create the circumstances that eventually made a move like this possible. And if the reported numbers are accurate, the consequences would extend far beyond one player. The figure at the center of this entire discussion is that reported $225 million valuation. The original report describes it as a 5-year, fully guaranteed agreement that could also include an ownership component. That would mean Clark would not simply be receiving compensation for playing basketball. She would potentially have a financial stake in the business surrounding her career. In other words, the argument is that she would have more influence, more security, and a greater connection to the organization she chooses to represent. That is a dramatically different proposition from simply signing another conventional player contract. To understand why the numbers sound so extreme, compare it with the salary structure described in the report. The script claims that the combined salary cap across the league's 12 teams is roughly $5.65 million. Under that comparison, the reported value of Clark's annual compensation would dwarf the payroll of an entire WNBA roster. The report goes even further, alleging that the signing payment by itself could exceed the league's total salary ceiling. Whether every figure ultimately proves accurate or not, the underlying point is obvious. A deal on that scale would completely change the financial conversation surrounding women's professional basketball. The reported package is also described as containing performance incentives that are almost impossible to compare with the league's traditional contracts. The source claims a payment of $1 million per game along with a $50 million championship-related bonus. Those are extraordinary numbers when placed next to the salaries historically associated with the WNBA. The report compares them with top annual player salaries that have traditionally been around a few $100,000. The contrast is what creates the controversy. One player could potentially earn in a single appearance what another player might make over a very long career. And that leads directly to the bigger issue. The argument is not simply that Caitlin Clark would be earning more money. The argument is that the market itself would be sending a message about her value. For years, the WNBA operated as the primary professional destination for elite American women's basketball players. That gave the league enormous leverage because players had limited alternatives at the highest level. The original commentary describes that environment as a structurally protected monopoly, where the league controlled the infrastructure, the franchises, and much of the available professional opportunity. That balance changes the moment an elite player has a credible alternative. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether a player should simply accept the system that already exists. The question becomes much more direct. Why accept less when another organization is prepared to pay substantially more? That is the pressure point created by the reported Clark deal. If one superstar can command an enormous number outside the traditional structure, every other player with meaningful leverage can begin looking at her own situation differently. This is why the original report presents the $225 million figure as something much bigger than an individual contract. It treats the amount as a market signal. If one organization values Clark at that level, other players, agents, sponsors, and competing leagues can use that valuation as a reference point. The consequences could affect negotiations across the sport, particularly for established stars whose contracts are approaching expiration. The report then shifts toward the response from league leadership. It claims that NBA Commissioner Adam Silver and WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert were involved in an urgent early morning meeting after the news emerged. The original account presents that meeting as evidence of internal concern, even describing it as a kind of reckoning over how the league could lose control of a player who had become one of its most commercially visible stars. Those claims should be treated as reported allegations rather than established facts, but they fit the central argument of the script. The problem is not simply that Clark has another offer. The larger issue is that the existence of that offer exposes weaknesses in the league's existing compensation structure. The story also raises the issue of how Clark was treated during her time in the WNBA. It points to restrictions, criticism, suspension controversies, social media disputes, and disagreements surrounding how the Indiana Fever handled her role. The original narrative argues that these incidents accumulated over time and gradually changed the relationship between Clark and the organization around her. There is a simple business principle at work here. Loyalty has a cost. If a player believes her contributions are being undervalued, eventually that player may begin asking what she could receive elsewhere. The report argues that Clark reached that point after spending years in an environment that, from her perspective, allegedly did not fully recognize the commercial value she was bringing to the league. That is where Cathy Engelbert becomes a central figure in the original narrative. The report portrays her leadership as an example of an institution responding too slowly to changing market conditions. It argues that instead of dramatically increasing player compensation earlier, the league leaned on gradual improvements, promises of continued growth, better travel arrangements, and appeals to the historical importance of the WNBA. The argument from the commentary is that those promises may not have been enough. Players are not simply participants in a sports league. They are economic actors with agents, opportunities, and increasingly sophisticated knowledge of their own market value. Once a player understands that her commercial value may be dramatically higher than her current compensation, patience can disappear very quickly. The script makes a similar argument about Amber Cox, connecting her to the Indiana Fever's decision-making surrounding Clark. It references claims about how Clark's performances were handled, how the organization promoted her, how much playing time she received, and how certain moments involving her were addressed publicly. One particularly controversial claim in the original script concerns the handling of Clark's 45-point double-double and the organization's social media response. Another allegation concerns Clark's suspension-related controversy and the use of teammates in public messaging. The original source also states that Cox gave interviews to the Indianapolis Star praising Clark's talent while simultaneously discussing plans to manage her playing time. Those are significant claims, but they remain allegations presented by the source and should not automatically be treated as proven facts. The broader point remains straightforward. Every management decision contributes to the relationship between a franchise and its star player. If those decisions repeatedly communicate that a player's impact is being limited, minimized, or misunderstood, eventually that player may decide that the best solution is to leave. And that is exactly what makes the reported $225 million deal so explosive. The original narrative argues that Clark's departure would not simply remove one player from a roster. It could remove a major source of attention, ticket demand, media coverage, sponsorship interest, and fan engagement. In that scenario, the organization would have to confront what its business looked like before Clark arrived and what it looks like after she is gone. That is a much bigger problem than losing a talented basketball player. It becomes a question of brand value. The report then predicts a domino effect across the rest of the league. Players approaching the end of their contracts could look at Clark's reported valuation and immediately have a conversation with their agents about their own worth. The question would no longer be, what does the league normally pay? It would become, why should my compensation remain limited if the market is clearly willing to pay more? That distinction matters. A single massive contract can reset expectations for an entire industry. In professional sports, one extraordinary deal can become the reference point for the next round of negotiations. It gives agents leverage, gives players a benchmark, and forces owners and executives to decide whether their existing system still reflects the market. The source specifically mentions Aya Wilson, describing her as deeply involved in negotiations. It also brings up Breanna Stewart and argues that the reported situation could create serious pressure for other established stars. Again, these statements come from the supplied script and should be understood as its claims rather than independently verified developments. The narrative then focuses on the idea of being mentally checked out. That phrase is used to describe a player who may have already reached an emotional decision before the official announcement arrives. In that situation, the discussion is no longer primarily about money. The internal calculation has already happened. The remaining step is simply revealing the decision publicly. The script makes a similar argument about Angel Reese, claiming that her enormous social media following could have an impact on whichever direction her career takes next. The logic is simple. Wherever a major star goes, a percentage of her audience can follow. That makes player movement a business issue, not merely a sporting decision. And that brings the story back to the central question. Who becomes the next player to ask why she should stay? Who becomes the next star to examine the numbers and realize that the existing system may no longer be the only option? Because once players understand that alternatives exist, the old leverage disappears. That is why the reported Clark agreement, regardless of how every specific number eventually develops, represents such a powerful idea. It challenges the assumption that the WNBA is the only place where elite women's basketball talent can build a valuable professional career. If another market can offer greater compensation, ownership opportunities, stronger financial guarantees, or more control, then every player suddenly has another negotiating tool. And that is the real story here. This is not only about Caitlin Clark. It is about what happens when a league's most commercially important players realize that they may have more power than the system previously allowed them to believe. The original report describes the alleged $225 million agreement as the first domino. Whether that prediction becomes reality remains to be seen. But the underlying issue is difficult to ignore. Once a market discovers that it can place a much higher value on its biggest stars, the old rules of compensation rarely remain untouched. The WNBA can respond by adapting. It can rethink its compensation model, strengthen the relationship between player value and league revenue, and find new ways to keep its biggest stars financially invested in the league. Or it can wait. And waiting may be the most expensive decision of all.